In this video, I'll be going through all the steps I took to create this custom subwoofer enclosure out of fiberglass from my 2020 Toyota Camry XSE, but it should be the same process for any vehicle. First step is to put down a layer of tape. Make sure you get good coverage because if there's any gaps, there could be resin that leaks through and the smell is really hard to get rid of. I chose the right side of my trunk to have this installed because that side, this little well doesn't get a lot of use, so it would be nice and out of the way. I'm using 1.5 ounce fiber mat. I chose to create pieces that were about 4 by 6 inches large. It was recommended to break up these pieces by hand rather than with the scissors. And this is because the uneven edges when you break it by hand give you better overlap and a stronger overall product. And I think in the end, I ended up using about 8 feet of my 50-inch wide chop mat. I'm using a 2-part mix. It is a polyester resin with a MEKP hardener. The store I bought it from recommended a 2% mixture ratio, however, the packaging suggests 1%, which I find gives a better working time of 10 to 15 minutes, and this is more manageable to me. Initially, I wanted to mix it in these yellow cups, however, this ended up being a disaster because the resin ended up melting the bottom of the cup and it ended up leaking everywhere, creating quite a mess. So these clear cups worked out a lot better. The first layer of fiberglass has to be done inside the car. It's a very simple but a very repetitive process. I find that it's a bit easier to put down a layer of resin first and then have your chop mat on top, followed by more resin to let it soak through. As I mentioned, this is just for the first layer. I didn't do all the layers while the form was still inside the car. I just did enough to make the form somewhat rigid enough for me to pull it out of the trunk, and then continue the rest of the process while working on a table in the garage. This is what it looked like once it was all done. I gave it about a day to dry in the car before I started to try to remove it. For me, I just peeled around the edges and stuck some newspaper between the tape layer and the mat of the car. That's because the tape is still quite sticky and prevents you from pulling it out. Then, as I was about to do this other side, I realized that I can just pull it straight out and it just came out of the car. From my research, using 1.5 ounce fiber mat, most places recommended doing at least 5 layers. This should give you a final fiberglass thickness of about 1/4 of an inch, which is about equivalent to 3/4 of an inch of plywood or MDF. As the fiber mat gets soaked with resin, you'll notice that it gets translucent, and this is how you know that you have enough resin to cover your fiber mat. Another thing to focus on is to make sure you don't have any air bubbles, because air bubbles will reduce the structural integrity of the final product. At this point, I decided to peel off the tape layer. You could wait to do it till after you cut off the excess fiberglass, or you could do it now. It doesn't really matter. The next step is to create a mounting point for your subwoofer. I decided to make mine 2 layers thick out of 3/4 inch plywood. My subwoofer came with this decorative piece, which I used to mark off the outer radius. However, I didn't have enough material to create 2 full rings, so I made 1 full ring and 2 partial rings. With the partial rings, I'll cut them in half and join them together to create the full ring. The reason I made them 2 layers thick is so that the screws will have enough material to bite into. For the inner radius of the mounting plate, you can refer to the subwoofer datasheet, which should give you this information. I made mine 1/8 of an inch larger than this dimension to allow for some margin of error and overlap of fiberglass. To make the marking for the inner circle, I used a stir stick that had a number of markings for various radius. Stick a nail at the center of your circle and use a pen at whatever marking you need. Make sure to wear some kind of eye protection. Don't want to take a chance of any of these bits flying in your eyes. I used some contact adhesive to hold these 2 pieces together. The process is pretty simple. Just spray the 2 pieces, give them a few minutes to dry, and then press them together. You can either use a couple screws to hold it together or clamps like I did. This step is completely optional. I decided to use a router to round off the inside of the mount just to make it look a little nicer, but functionally it will not make a difference. I'm using some hot glue to hold the ring in place temporarily so I can do a test fit just to see how it all fits together in the trunk. The main thing I'm checking for with this test fit is the clearance of the hinge from the side and from the back. Just make sure that when you're closing the trunk, it's not going to hit the enclosure, the ring, or where you think your subwoofer is going to end up. Overall, I think it fits really great in the trunk, and I still have access to most of my trunk space. I don't lose too much by putting it in this corner. But before I take it out again, I decided to mark off where I'm going to have to trim the enclosure. With the enclosure back out of the car, I marked the rest of the perimeter of where I'm going to be cutting off the excess. The first time I tried to cut fiberglass, I used a jigsaw, and the result was terrible, because within 4 or 5 inches of cutting, the blade was completely dull. The better option for this is an angle grinder with a mask, because there's a lot of dust that's created, and it's very bad for your health. With the enclosure cut out to its final shape, it's time to glue the ring in place before we do our final layer of fiberglass. But not before another test fit, just to make sure everything fits well in the trunk. A 12-inch sub is a little large for this spot in the trunk, but it just fits. I'm using these 2 pieces of scrap that were created while I was cutting up the ring for extra support. Since this is where your subwoofer is going to be sitting, now would be a great time to check how it all fits together. Be sure to check around all sides to make sure you have adequate clearance and nothing is touching. I'm using a layer of felt for the front face of my subwoofer. The placement doesn't have to be exact, just make sure you have enough overlap so you can hot glue it in place so it doesn't move around. This might be a little overkill, but I used a ring of staples to hold the sheet in place on the mounting ring. And as I mentioned, I'm using hot glue to hold it in place along the edge. With the felt, I tried to soak it with resin before applying the rest of the layer. The felt in itself acts as one of the base layers. Since there were some stray pieces of fiberglass that I missed flattening with the resin, I'm back at it with the grinder to try to smoothen those out. This is one of the most important layers that we're working on. This is the final layer of carpeting that we'll see from the trunk. The process is the same as before. Apply a layer to both sides, wait a few minutes to dry, and then press the two materials together. When I applied the carpet, I had to make sure that it was centered over the enclosure to begin with. Then I started from the ring, working around from there, making sure there were no wrinkles on the front face. The back of the enclosure is a bit more forgiving if you have some wrinkles because you won't be seeing that. One of the final steps is to drill a hole for the speaker wire. I couldn't find a good terminal, so I just ran the speaker wire directly out of the enclosure. You just need a drill bit that's the approximate diameter of your speaker wire. I've left enough length of speaker wire such that if I ever need to remove the subwoofer, it could be removed and rest flat on the table without the wire being constraining. And to seal up the hole we just made, I'm using a bit of silicone. I want to maintain easy access to my spare tire if I ever need it, so I want to make sure that it's easy to remove the enclosure. I'm using these quick disconnects, which are intended for luminaires, but they work pretty well for this application as well. I'm adding a bit of Velcro to help keep the enclosure in place so that it doesn't slide around. I start off by using a bit of masking tape to mark off the location on the enclosure and on the trunk of where the Velcro should go. This is what the final product looks like. It looks very clean and OEM, doesn't take up very much space in the trunk, and the color match of the carpet I got is very close to what's existing in the trunk